CS Map Stories. Prodigy. Hello everybody, it's me, Slade Crowley. Today I want to talk about one of those Counter-Strike maps that probably doesn't get mentioned nearly as much as it should anymore. Prodigy. If you've been around Counter-Strike for a long time, you probably remember it. Maybe you remember the map itself. Maybe you remember getting hopelessly lost in it. Or maybe you just remember looking at it and wondering why the hell anyone thought building a military installation like this was a good idea. Either way, Prodigy has a story. The map was created by Soviet-born Russian mapmaker Alexander Manilov, better known to the Counter-Strike community as Hobbit. And if that name sounds familiar, he's also the man behind Office. But Manilov's story starts before Counter-Strike. He became interested in level design at a very young age, first making levels for Doom 2, and later moving on to Quake. His work with Quake and its editing tools eventually led him toward Worldcraft, and from there, into the strange little world of Counter-Strike mapping. Eventually, he discovered Counter-Strike at a LAN party and became involved with the game himself. And one of the results was Prodigy. The map originally appeared in Counter-Strike Beta 4.0 alongside other early bomb-defusal maps like Dust and Nuke. Eventually, Valve bought the rights to Prodigy and Office. We don't know exactly how much Manilov was paid, but considering how young he was at the time, there's something kind of remarkable about the idea of a teenager making maps for a game he loved, and then suddenly having Valve come along and say, essentially, well, we'll take that. Not a bad way to spend your teenage years. Manilov's career continued from there. He would later work with Gearbox Software and eventually contribute to Team Fortress 2 as a contractual level designer. But enough about the guy who made it. Let's talk about the map. Prodigy takes place inside what appears to be a military installation hidden somewhere in the mountains. The terrorists have to destroy one of two targets, the computer lab or the fuel pipeline control room. The counter-terrorists, naturally, have to stop them. Simple enough. Playing the map? Not quite. One of the things I've always liked about Prodigy is the atmosphere. Because here's the strange thing about it. It's built largely from the same basic Half-Life assets that you've seen 100 times before. And yet, somehow, it doesn't feel like a generic Half-Life facility. It feels like a place. A secret military installation buried somewhere in the mountains. You've got the underground corridors, the control rooms, the industrial machinery, the exterior paths, and all these little spaces that make the whole thing feel much larger than it actually is. There isn't anything particularly exotic about the individual textures. It's what Manilov did with them, and I've always appreciated that. I remember playing Prodigy back in the early 2000s, mostly with my stepbrother and friends. Sometimes we'd be playing late at night, and by late I mean 2 in the morning, which in retrospect was probably a completely reasonable way to spend our time. I always liked the map. The gameplay, though? Well, the gameplay was what it was. Prodigy isn't what I'd call a perfectly designed competitive map, but I always found it incredibly fun once you actually knew how to play it. And that's where I think Prodigy becomes interesting. Knowledge is power on this map. Once you know the corridors, the rotations, the choke points, and the positions people like to hold, the entire thing starts to make more sense. The problem is getting to that point. For a new player, Prodigy can be a confusing nightmare. There are long corridors that turn into defensive strongholds, tight choke points, enclosed areas, multiple routes. And then there's the mountain. Because apparently getting shot wasn't enough. You can also just fall off the map and die. It's a remarkably efficient way of reminding you that gravity still works. On a public server, Prodigy can become complete chaos. Everybody is running around. Nobody knows where they're going. Someone is probably lost. Someone else is probably camping. And somebody has almost certainly fallen off the mountain. But competitively, the same layout creates a much bigger problem. The counter-terrorists get to hold. The terrorists have to push. And they don't just have to push once. They have to push through one area, then another, then another. There are so many points where the terrorists can get stalled that a coordinated attack can start feeling less like a single push and more like trying to open a series of locked doors while 5 people are shooting at you. And that's where the map starts to show its weaknesses. A map like Dust 2 can sometimes reward one big coordinated attack. If the push works, everything changes. Prodigy doesn't always give you that opportunity. There are simply too many places where the counter-terrorists can establish defensive positions. And once they know the map, they know exactly where those positions need to be. That made Prodigy heavily counter-terrorist-sided. And I think that probably turned a lot of people off from it. Because to really enjoy Prodigy, you had to learn it. You had to understand the map. You had to know where you were going. You had to know where the other team was likely to be. And if you didn't, well, good luck. Prodigy in competitive Counter-Strike. And this is where the history of Prodigy gets interesting. Because despite all of those problems, Prodigy wasn't some forgotten map that nobody took seriously. It actually saw legitimate competitive play. According to Wikipedia, its competitive lifespan was roughly 2000 to 2005. That puts it right in the middle of the formative years of competitive Counter-Strike. And it's worth remembering just how young Counter-Strike was at this point. The competitive map pool wasn't carved in stone. Teams were still figuring out strategies. Players were still figuring out what worked. And map makers were still figuring out what a competitive Counter-Strike map was supposed to look like. Prodigy was one of those experiments. It appeared in early leagues, clan wars, qualifiers, and tournaments, including World Cyber Games competition during the early 2000s. And for a while, it had a place. But Counter-Strike was changing. The game was becoming more competitive. Teams were getting better. Strategies were becoming more sophisticated. And suddenly, those strange little quirks that made Prodigy interesting also became liabilities. The choke points were still there. The confusing routes were still there. And the counter-terrorists still had the advantage. Eventually, the competitive scene moved on. By the middle of the 2000s, Prodigy had largely disappeared from serious high-level competition. It remained part of the Counter-Strike experience, and people continued playing it. But it never became the kind of permanent competitive staple that Dust 2, Inferno, Nuke, or Train became. And honestly, I don't think that's particularly surprising. But here's where I think Prodigy deserves a little more credit. Because when we talk about old Counter-Strike maps, it's very easy to judge them entirely by modern standards. Is it balanced? Is the layout efficient? Are the bomb sites properly designed? Are there too many choke points? Can the terrorists execute properly? And those are all perfectly reasonable questions. But sometimes I think we're missing something. Does the map have character? Prodigy does. It feels like somewhere. And for a game that was built on the back of Half-Life's engine and a relatively small collection of assets, that's not nothing. Manilov took those basic textures and created a place that, at least in my imagination, feels like it could actually exist. A strange military facility buried in the mountains. Cold corridors. Industrial machinery, control rooms, long passages disappearing into darkness. And somewhere outside, a very convenient cliff waiting for somebody to walk off of it. Was Prodigy perfectly balanced? No. Was the layout confusing? Absolutely. Was it sometimes frustrating? Definitely. But I still remember playing it. I remember playing it with my stepbrother. I remember playing it with friends. I remember playing it at 2 in the morning. And I think that's worth something. A map doesn't necessarily have to be perfect to be memorable. Sometimes, it just has to give you a place you remember. And Prodigy did that. It wasn't the best competitive map Counter-Strike ever produced. It wasn't the most balanced. It certainly wasn't the easiest to learn. But it was different. And especially in those early years of Counter-Strike, when the game was still figuring out what it wanted to become, different mattered. Maybe that's why I still remember Prodigy after all these years. Not because it was perfect, but because it felt like somewhere. And sometimes, that's enough. This has been CS Map Stories. I'll see you in the next one.